Welcome back, deep divers. We always get some interesting source material suggested to us, but this one's particularly intriguing, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, this one definitely piqued my curiosity when I first saw it.
The teacup.
Uh-huh. A teacup. Simple, everyday object.
But we're not talking about, the perfect afternoon Earl Grey here, are we?
No, not this time.
We're talking about teacup reading and the art of fortune-telling by A Highland Seer. Tessiography. Trying to catch a glimpse of the future in the swirling patterns of tea leaves.
Exactly. And it's got a surprisingly rich history, especially when you look at Scottish folklore. I mean, it sounds almost quaint, doesn't it?
It does. But, the idea that these everyday objects, the things we surround ourselves with, could hold some kind of hidden meaning or message about what's to come, well, that's a concept that seems to resonate across cultures and time periods.
Absolutely. I mean, think about it. Tea itself hasn't been around in Britain that long, really, only since the 17th century or so.
Right, so this book, Teacup Reading, the author actually makes the point that while it might not be ancient, it likely evolved from earlier forms of what they call liquid divination. Like the Greeks, they had this practice called kotabos.
Oh, yeah, I remember reading about that. They'd try to fling the last drops of wine from their cups into a target and then interpret the splashes for like romantic insights. I guess some things never change. People always looking for love.
Always. So this urge to know what the future holds seems it's pretty universal. And in Scotland, teacup reading really took hold, especially among, well, ordinary folks.
Yeah, and particularly the spae-wives, those local village fortune tellers, they were really integrated into their communities.
Now, what's interesting about teacup reading and the art of fortune-telling by a Highland seer is that it really tries to demystify the whole process. The author points out there were all these books on grand occult subjects, but hardly any focused specifically on teacup reading. So they set out to provide a clear, practical guide that anyone could use. Sort of like, a domestic version of prophecy.
Yeah, and that's exactly what caught our listeners' attention, right? They sent this book in, clearly curious about this method of divination, its history. And I think for a lot of us, there's something appealing about these personal, almost intimate forms of fortune-telling. It feels accessible.
Definitely. So in this deep dive, we're aiming to give you a solid understanding of how teacup reading works, at least according to this Highland tradition. No need to get bogged down in, tons of obscure details, but enough to spark that same curiosity our listener felt.
Right, because, like the author says, it really can be an innocent and inexpensive amusement.
Exactly. So let's jump right in. And the book starts off by addressing, the very reason people might turn to divination in the first place. And they reference a major war happening at the time. We're probably talking about World War I here, given when the book was published.
Yeah, and they talk about how during times of widespread uncertainty and anxiety, like with loved ones off fighting, that desire to know what the future holds, well, intensifies, right?
Of course.
Yeah.
It makes total sense. If things feel unstable in the present, you start looking for any kind of, anchor in the future, even if it's just a possibility.
Right, any scrap of information, any sense of control, And the book points out, unfortunately, this also leads to, well, let's just say certain individuals who might exploit those fears for their own profit.
So they really emphasize the importance of the seer's intentions. And they talk about how the Highland tradition valued these spae-wives who didn't take payment for their readings. They were doing it almost as a community service.
Yeah, there's this contrast drawn between them and the professional fortune tellers. They argue that focusing on, fees and payments can cloud judgment and even affect the accuracy of readings. The idea is that you need a clear, unbiased mind.
And they go even further, suggesting that the most unbiased reading you could get is actually by reading your own teacup.
Right, because then there's no financial transaction influencing the interpretation. You're purely connected to your own subconscious.
Interesting. And this leads into, I think, a fascinating aspect of the book, how they present this almost scientific view of destiny. They argue that it's not about some preordained fate, but rather a consequence of past actions shaping future events. So future events are like shadows of what we do now.
It's a really interesting way of framing it, isn't it? That even if there are future possibilities already set in motion, how we navigate the present can still have an impact.
And divination, like with teacup reading, becomes a way for our subconscious to project these shadows onto those symbols. It's like by engaging in this ritual, we're giving our inner awareness a chance to become visible.
Exactly. And the book emphasizes the specific method cards, dice, tea leaves. It's not as crucial as the seer's mental state during the reading. It's about creating a space for those hidden shadows to emerge.
So let's move on to the practical side. How do you actually do a teacup reading according to our Highland Seer?
Right. So first, the type of tea matters. And forget your fancy blends here. They specifically recommend China tea.
Really? Why is that?
Well, apparently Indian tea and the cheaper blends, they have too much dust and little bits that can muddy the symbols. China tea has more intact leaves, makes for clearer patterns.
Makes sense. And what about the cup itself? Any old mug will do.
Not quite. They recommend a cup with a wide opening, not too small a bottom. The ideal is a plain white breakfast cup. Nothing fancy, no patterns on the inside.
She can really focus on those leaves. No distractions.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've got our China tea, plain white cup. What next?
You drink the tea, but leave about a half teaspoonful of liquid. Then hold the cup in your left hand, whim up, and turn it 3 times from left to right, kind of briskly.
Okay, 3 times. Got it. And then what?
Then you slowly, very carefully turn the cup over onto the saucer. And you have to leave it there for a full minute to drain. This part's crucial.
All right, so we're letting it drain. Is there anything I should be, like, thinking about while this is happening?
Well, that depends. If you're taking this seriously, they recommend really concentrating on your destiny, almost willing the symbols to be accurate. But if it's just for fun, you can be more relaxed about it.
Okay, so a minute's up, the cup's drained. What now?
Now you turn it back over, carefully, and hold it in your hand. You can rotate it gently to see all the symbols, but try not to disturb them.
And now the interpretation begins. But where do you even start? There must be leaves everywhere.
Right, well, the handle of the cup represents the person getting the reading, sort of like the house and tarot readings.
Okay, so where the leaves fall in relation to the handle, that has meaning.
Exactly. The bottom of the cup symbolizes the distant future, the sides are events that are closer, and the rim, those are things that might happen immediately. And the closer a symbol is to the handle, the sooner it's likely to occur.
So it's all about those spatial relationships. Fascinating. But there are probably so many symbols. How do you make sense of it all?
Well, first, don't just focus on isolated shapes. You have to consider the whole picture, balance out any good and bad signs you see, and don't be afraid to use your imagination a bit. They compare it to seeing pictures in the fire.
Right, because it's not like the leaves are going to form perfect images. You have to see those resemblances to trees, animals, anchors, all those sorts of things.
Exactly. And size matters too. Like a small symbol for, say, money might mean a small amount, but a big one, well, that could indicate a windfall.
So it's about paying attention to all those details. What about, like, letters or numbers? Do those show up?
Yeah, sometimes you get individual leaves or stems forming letters or numbers. Letters usually stand for initials of people involved in upcoming news. Numbers could be dates or amounts of money. And again, their placement in the cup influences how you interpret them.
Okay. So much to consider. What else should we be looking for?
Another thing is lines of dots. Those usually represent journeys. Longer lines mean longer trips. And the direction, well, the handle of the cup is south, so you can kind of figure out the compass direction from there.
So if a line of dots starts near the handle and ends up on the opposite side, that could mean...
A journey away from home.
Interesting. And dots around a symbol, what does that mean?
Usually that's a sign of money related to whatever that symbol represents.
Oh, like dots around a house shape could mean.
Financial gains related to your property. Maybe a sale or an inheritance.
Makes sense. So we're seeing all these symbols, good ones, bad ones. How do you know which ones to focus on?
Well, you have to weigh it all out. A really strong positive symbol might outweigh a few smaller negative ones. But if there's a big, prominent negative symbol, that's a warning sign no matter how many lucky charms you see.
So it's about context and balance. You can't just cherry pick the good stuff.
Exactly. And it's also important to remember that teacup fortunes are mainly focused on the short term, the next few hours or maybe a day. It's not about predicting your whole life.
Right. It's more about immediate concerns and influences. And speaking of which, they advise against, reading your tea leaves too often. Once a week is enough.
Yeah, they say doing it too much leads to confusing, contradictory readings. Not to mention, it might drive you a bit mad.
Too much future gazing, eh? Okay, so let's say I have a specific question. Can I use the teacup for that?
Yes, they do mention using it for what they call horary questions, like those focused on a single issue. But the key is your mind needs to be totally fixed on that question while you're turning the cup.
Right, so you're channeling all your energy into that one question. Now, for the Heart of Teacup reading, those symbols, how did they come up with all those meanings?
Well, They admit it's somewhat arbitrary, based on generations of seers observing patterns and associating them with events. It's more experiential than scientific, if you will.
Like a collective wisdom built up over time.
Exactly. And this author collected interpretations from spae-wives all over Scotland and even other parts of Britain. Sometimes different seers had different interpretations for the same symbol, so he tried to choose the most common or authoritative ones for the book.
So let's give our listeners a taste of those symbols. What are some examples?
Sure, an anchor, generally a good sign, success in business, constancy in love. But if it's cloudy, it could mean the opposite. Birds in flight, usually good news coming your way. A coffin, well, that usually signifies illness or even death.
Not the happiest symbol. What about shapes like circles or crosses?
Circles are usually associated with money or presents. Crosses typically signify trouble or delays.
Okay, so those are pretty clear. What about something like a heart?
A heart, especially if it's got dots around it, points to pleasures through money. And of course, a ring is all about marriage, but where it's placed matters. Near a letter could be the initial of your future spouse. Cloudy, unhappy marriage. At the bottom of the cup, the wedding might not happen at all.
Wow, that's really specific. What about simple lines? Straight ones?
Straight lines usually mean peace, happiness, a long life, maybe a pleasant journey. And triangles, those are usually a sign of good luck, unexpected legacies.
So much variety. Now, the book doesn't just list symbols, does it?
No, it also has this really interesting section with specimen cups and interpretations. It's basically illustrations of actual teacups after readings with the author's analysis of the symbols.
So you can see how it all comes together. Can you give us an example?
Yeah, like figure 1. It's got symbols like pistols, a cannon next to a trident, a pear, a tree, and a house. And the author interprets this as a very fortunate reading, maybe for a man entering naval service. Success, honor, wealth. The symbols tie into his profession, and the pear and the tree are seen as signs of promotion and prosperity.
So they're really weaving a narrative based on those symbols and their positions. What about another example?
Sure, figure 3 shows a crescent moon, a bird in flight, triangles, and a flag. And this one's interpreted as prosperity coming from a journey that's the moon and the lines around it. The bird flying towards the handle means good news from an official source, maybe connected to someone with a name starting with H, but there's also a warning there, the flag, potential danger from an adversary.
So even in a generally positive reading, there are still challenges. Now, the book wraps up with a section that goes beyond teacup reading itself, right? It's about general omens.
Right, and they point out that the belief in omens goes back centuries across so many cultures. They argue it's more than just superstition. Maybe it's rooted in generations of observing patterns and making connections. Or maybe it's even a form of intuition.
So those gut feelings might be more than just random thoughts. What are some of the omens they list?
Well, there's the classic ones, like an acorn falling on you means good luck. A black cat entering your house means trouble caused by betrayal. Finding a 4-leaf clover, that's luck, happiness, prosperity.
And spilling salt. Everyone knows that's bad luck.
Right, but you can counteract it by throwing a pinch over your left shoulder.
Ah, the old remedies.
Exactly. Finding a horseshoe is good luck, breaking a mirror is bad luck. And then there are omens connected to animals, like magpies, 1 for sorrow, 2 for joy, that sort of thing. Even shooting stars, if you make a wish while it's moving, it'll come true.
It's amazing how many of these we still hear today. So wrapping things up, we've really explored teacup reading in depth as it's practiced in this Highland tradition. A very personal ritual focused on unbiased interpretation and this fascinating symbolic language of the leaves. We even touched on the broader world of omens and how these beliefs seem to persist across time and cultures.
And for our listener and all of you deep divers out there, I hope this has sparked some curiosity, whether it's just a historical interest or maybe you're thinking about trying a reading yourself. It can be a fun way to connect with a different way of thinking about the world.
Exactly. And we've only covered a fraction of what's in the book itself. There's a whole list of symbols and omens to explore, and if this kind of thing grabs you, well, there's a whole world of divination practices to discover.
And this brings us to our final thought for today. Even if we view practices like teacup reading or omens through a modern lens as symbolic or psychological frameworks, their long history and cross-cultural presence really make you think. What is it about human nature that seeks to find meaning, anticipate the future, in these seemingly random patterns of everyday life? It's a question worth pondering, don't you think?
Absolutely. Until next time, keep
Yeah.
diving.